Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I am one of your hosts today, Jen, and I am joined by my illustrious colleague. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Kaye, and I'm one of the Reader Services librarian here at the Syosset Public Library. I'm here to recommend books. That's my whole job, my whole shtick, and so I read a lot. And this is one of the books we read this week. So
yes, and we are so excited to talk to our guest today, who is here to talk about an absolutely delicious little rom-com. It is so much fun and like the perfect fall cozy read. I think it is so seasonally appropriate right now. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Nadia El-Fassi. I'm the author of HEX EVER, which is a cozy and spicy cottagecore rom-com about a kitchen witch called Dina who owns a magical cafe in London, and it's a romance between her and Scott, who is a curator at the British Museum, and it's got lots of friends, wedding hijinks, countryside manners with spooky hedge mazes, magical familiars, and spice. Lots of spice.
What a recipe. Yeah. Perfect.
Spice not just between characters, but also in the baking.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Lots of cinnamon going on.
And so before we get to the book itself, could you talk a little bit about your career and your journey to the book? I understand that you are a commissioning editor at Orbit Books. Could you talk a little bit about how that also shaped your journey as a writer?
Yeah, for sure. So I did a creative writing degree post-grad, focusing on poetry, but during the whole time I was working as a bookseller at Waterstones, which is the main bookstore chain over here in the UK. And after that, I started working in publishing, in science fiction, fantasy, and horror publishing. So most of what I do as a commissioning editor at Orbit is acquire titles for our list. A lot of what I buy is in the cozy fantasy space, books like Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. Are you a fan of that one? Oh, I love it. Yes, I love it so much. I do a fair amount of horror as well, some sort of epic fantasy, a whole mix of things really, publishing into the UK market and Australian, sort of New Zealand, all of that whole Commonwealth market. And it definitely helped me. I think, we saw cozy fantasy rising up as a sort of a new wave of it as like a sort of specific genre in like 2022-ish, late 2021. And I remember that's around the time that I started writing this, because I thought, well, it was also mid-pandemic and I wanted something to cheer me up and something lovely and sweet and wholesome to fall into. But I also wasn't seeing much cozy fantasy that also had a sort of spicy rom-com element, and then I read Erin Sterling's The HEX, and I was like, oh, I love this, and I would love to do something that kind of feels practical magic-y in tone but has more smut. So that kind of, I guess being on the sort of publisher side of it, seeing how the trends grow, and so although I wasn't necessarily writing this to trend, it definitely helped inspire me and help me get there.
Yeah, I feel like we really saw the rise of cozy fantasy with like Legends and Lattes. A lot of people say that that's like the starting point. I do a lot of the book ordering for the library of most of the fantasy, sci-fi, and horror. So I have seen like that trend a lot. Even this year, I think we've gotten a bunch this year. The Spell Shop is like one of them that's been high on lists, and then your book and a few other things I've seen. And even like recently, I think we might even do a display, cozy cottagecore fantasy.
Ooh,
love that. Yeah, I remember I was speaking about this with someone, and we sort of felt that there was the whole grimdark genre of like sort of nihilistic epic fantasy in like 2015 to like 2019, and then everyone got so depressed in the pandemic that we needed light-hearted escapism, and then cozy fantasy is the perfect medicinal treat for that.
Yeah, and I think you did really you struck a good like balance, because you're right, there's not really a lot of like steam, a lot of spice in this genre. So like, you're adding a little cinnamon.
Yes.
That's my hope.
So I'd love if you could tell us a little bit more about Dina. I really love her. I love that she's sort of like a hot mess, but she's so lovable.
She's so sweet.
Yeah, could you talk about shaping her character and maybe like her relationship to magic too? Because I really love how like the kitchen magic works in this.
Yeah, I feel like Dina is a mess in so many aspects of her life, except for with her kitchen witch magic. That's sort of the one thing that she knows how to do. She feels confident in. She can sort of flex her creativity in terms of, crafting new spells. The way she sort of does it is that she draws on wonderful things in life, like, the feeling of kissing a cat on their forehead, putting on warm socks after a bath, those sorts of things, her own experiences that she puts into her sort of magical baking, and that's what she sells to her customers in the cafe. She's half Moroccan, much like myself, and I wanted to write about that sort of aspect of it, particularly because I love baking Moroccan biscuits and treats. I feel like we always say that Moroccan people's like our blood is 50% honey because we are such a sweet tooth country. So there had to be lots of like honey based recipes and stuff that she makes. And I wanted to tap into that sort of aspect of her. She is British, but she's also Moroccan. And drawing on her sort of cultural heritage and the way that she would represent that through the things that she makes at the cafe. But yeah, she is a bit of a hot mess. She's got this pesky hex hanging over her, which means that anyone who falls for her or sorts of like starts to have strong romantic feelings for her will end up meeting, I wouldn't say a grisly end, not quite that serious. It's still a cozy fantasy book, but they might, get in an accident here and there's a sort of threat of injury. So that's constantly hanging over her head for all sort of romantic entanglements that she might have. It was also really important to me to make her bi. I think, there isn't, she's not explicitly, although Morocco is like a Muslim country, she's not Muslim. I kind of wanted to have a character whose sort of North African identity was separate from religion in that sense, and so the magic isn't really connected in that in any way. But I think her bisexuality is, without spoilers, is a part of like her magic and sort of holds something over her. So as much as this is a romance novel, it also is a kind of coming out novel in a way, I hope.
Yeah, I could see that. Well, especially towards the end. Yeah, because it's kind of happened. Sorry, spoiler. Sorry.
Spoilers, sorry. It's always so funny when you're like, and they end happily ever after. Spoilers, but also it's a rom-com. So
it's part of the gist of a rom-com. Yeah, she seems really secure in her bi identity, which I appreciated, because we do have a lot of books where it's like, oh, I'm bi, but it's no big deal, and like it's a part of me, but it's not, and like there's like a lot of wishy-washy bis in fiction, I feel like, and I don't think, I mean, yeah, Dina could be wishy-washy with a few other things, but I don't think she's ever wishy-washy about her identity, and I think that was really refreshing to read in this book.
I think I really wanted. So I actually came out as bi after I was married, and I'm married to a cishet man, and I don't feel like it means that I'm any less bi just because I'm in a long sort of relationship with a man. And I think there are so many people out there like myself, like there's so many of us, and I really wanted to have that sort of representation. But I think canonically, I think this is the only book that I'll probably ever write where both characters aren't bi. My second book is Bi for Bi and focuses a lot on like the experience of being a man and being bisexual, and like how whether women are attracted to that. Like there's so much biphobia, and I feel like this is my way of fighting that in a small way.
Oh, that's so exciting to hear. I'm very excited.
We love that. Great. We're all about that. Well, speaking of men, we should talk about Scott Mason a little bit. I love that you made him a curator of the British Museum, but kind of like a rebel curator. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so I pretty much spent so much of my childhood wandering around London's museums and galleries. My parents were always taking me to stuff there. So I feel like it was a no-brainer to write a character who worked in a museum. He kind of has like the aspirational job that we all wish we had, where you get to like go into the cool archives and look at the magical trinkets in the museum that everyone's forgotten about. But I did think there is such a sort of obviously strong colonial history in the British Museum of objects being taken from countries all around the world and not returned. And I didn't think I could write a character as a love interest, as someone that we're wholeheartedly supposed to support. and also just have him blindly following that along. So yeah, he's kind of in his own way doing a reverse Indiana Jones. So the symbols of protection exhibition, which he's creating in the book, I don't really think this is a spoiler, but he is the plan is that the objects within the exhibition will travel around the world on the global exhibition tour, and when they reach the country of origin, they will then be donated to a museum in that country of origin, which is probably me just putting my politics into the book in a way.
That is so cool. Like I literally wrote in my notes, like he's a decolonial Indiana Jones. And
Yeah.
I'm like, that sounds
Yeah.
so
That's
cool.
exactly what he is. Well, and like the British Museum is so famous for like exactly
Yeah.
they have a lot of stolen artifacts. Even recently, like I saw they have one of the statues from what is it, the Parthenon, I think it is, in Greece, and it's like
Yes.
the one that's missing. And
Mm.
in Athens, they have like a display where they proudly show we are missing this one statue. The British Museum has it and they won't give it back to us. And so I found that part of the book was kind of funny because I was like, oh yeah, she's also poking at this
Yeah.
issue that the British Museum has. And I think that makes Scott a lot more interesting too.
Yes.
I'm glad. I think also, he has this sort of he grew up in a group home and had this connection with sort of like luck talismans or charms, or like trying to find something that would bring him luck so that he would be fostered into a loving family, and has that sort of negative experience from his childhood until he was eventually fostered by his mums. And I love the idea that he sort of had this kind of like disillusionment of like, I really wish these talismans would work for me, but they didn't. And then he meets this woman who proves that magic is real and everything he kind of dreamed and hoped for since he was a child exists. So that's, I think, a part of his character.
That's a beautiful journey for him. I
Yeah.
love that. Yeah.
Good for Scott. We all need something like that.
too.
Yeah.
I'd love if we could I'd love if we could talk about writing spice. I
Mm.
am so curious about that process and how people approach it. Like, do you approach it from a sensory point of view or like an anatomical point of view? Sometimes there are so many ways to write it. So like, what is your approach?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it ties into like being an editor. I'm editing a lot of spicy books as well, and I love seeing the sort of the scale of spiciness. There are a lot of authors, I think you see this a lot in like sort of like high fantasy romantasy books, where they will be sort of open door sex scenes, but there won't be explicit words are used. It's more like the heat of her, like
Yeah.
deep within, those sorts of like slightly more lyrical, poetic turns of phrase. We all know what they're talking about, but they're not calling them explicit. And I made the very distinct choice to go very, very explicit. More so just because I think, in the vein of like rom-coms, Lana Ferguson, Tessa Bailey, all of that, there is a sort of explicitness used. I wanted to kind of find like a soft space between that where it doesn't feel quite like erotica, but it's sort of heading in that direction. And this is my sort of lighter hand with it. Book 2 is a bit more BDSM focused, and so I want to play more with like power play and dynamics in that respect. So I think with that in mind, I have to sort of ease people in with my first novel, so to not sort of shock and surprise them too much. But I think writing spice, I come from a fan fiction background. I've written a lot of fan fiction, so I think I have had ample chances to practice, I guess, writing spice. With the book being dual points of view, I think it was quite fun writing sex scenes from Scott's point of view, because I was like, how would a man feel about this? But I think that's where the bisexuality comes in quite handy, because you're like, yeah, women are really hot, and like, let me just describe this from this perspective. So that maybe that made it easier in a sort of unintentional way.
I mean this in the nicest way possible. I had a feeling that you wrote fan fiction.
I will take that as a huge compliment.
You should. I
Oh,
mean it that way.
Yeah.
I was like reading the book, and I think it was one of the sex scenes. I was like, I feel like she writes fan fiction. Something about this sex scene. And I love that, because like I've read tons of fan fiction.
Yes, yeah,
so
me
like,
too.
it was kind of like, this is cozy for me. I feel at home now.
What I love about fan fiction is that it can be so individual about like a writer's like preferences and like how they see stories, but it's so communal too. Like you
Yeah.
get to grow as a writer and like really connect with like an audience. Like it's a really cool, like not just a pastime, but like a network of people.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I was going to say a fair amount of my job going forward is actually like I'm working with some fan fiction authors, Brigitte Knightley, who wrote a very popular fan fiction. We're publishing a sort of original story by her with a similar ship feel to it next year. And I'm just so, I think, you know, fan fiction writers write some of the best slow burn, like banter filled romance. And I if I can only ever get close to writing that kind of thing, then I will feel like I've done something successful.
Well, we've seen a lot in the last couple of years. A lot of fan fiction is being published with
Yeah.
names changed and all that jazz. And like then you hear through the grapevine, like, this is a fan fiction. It's, you know, it's this actual ship. And I'm always like, that's so wild. I'm
Yes.
so happy for these people.
I'd love to talk a little bit too about your approach to romantic tension. And this is a question that I tend to ask of all romance writers, because you sort of have to like, you know, balance the things that are, you know, sort of pushing them together, the forces in their life and in them, and the things that are sort of pulling them apart. And like, how do you keep that rope taut? And like, how do you help that structure? Like, how does that help structure your story? Yes.
It is a tricky one because I think obviously enemies to lovers is such a prevalent theme at the moment, and that's can make it easier to structure the tension because they kind of hate each other until they don't. But for me, I wanted to write something which maybe felt slightly more realistic for contemporary romance. You know, both of the characters are in their late 20s, early 30s. They see each other, and I think, you know, when you do see someone, if you do experience physical attraction, then when you see someone that you like in public, you feel that physical attraction. And I think that is what happens with Dina and Scott. So although I wouldn't qualify it as like insta love, I would say it's like insta lust in some ways but I think that that is generally how things happen in reality. And so it's then a question of, okay, so you have this physical attraction to someone, but you don't really know each other. And I think that the more you get to know each other, the more you sort of, I think, you know, I'm a big fan of forced proximity in that sense. So you throw these people together again and again, and you see the way that they would react in these situations. I have the sort of blanket setting of a wedding weekend away in my book, of the sort of the best friends. So Dina is the maid of honor and Scott is the best man. They've never met in person, but they have their friends matchmaking them. And so what we really have is a sort of selection of scenes where they're being sort of forced together again and again and dancing around each other. And there's sort of tension there of like no one wanting to say, well, I actually find that you're quite attractive and I'm not really sure how to approach this. And I think I have a lot of fun with matchmaking friends and matchmaking animal familiars in that sense. So yeah, I think tension it is a really hard thing to do. I don't know if I can sort of quantify if I've managed to do it, how I've managed to do it. I think potentially not letting them kiss for about 70 pages helps. You know, you have that build up, and then by the time that you're like one chapter away from it, you should just be like holding the book screaming like, kiss, god damn it. So, you know, that's the ideal type of tension, I reckon.
Yeah. When you set out to write this book or any story, do you have like some tropes in mind when you like start to come up with your ideas? Do you have a favorite trope?
My favorite trope is forced proximity. I love nothing more than taking two people and squishing them into a small space and then seeing what happens. A book I read, which is actually not sort of overtly a romance book. It's a sort of like a sort of multi-POV fantasy, high fantasy, sort of Venetian inspired, called Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick, which came out a few years ago, and I was an assistant at Orbit when it first came out, and there was a scene between that where these two characters are like hiding in a wardrobe. One of them is like, you know, a masked character who's sort of not revealing his identity to the other one, and he exhales his breath and she feels it on the back of her neck, and I was like, that's it, this is the sexiest thing I've ever read. And they're not even kissing. So I feel like, yeah, forced proximity for me is such a good way of sort of like amping up physical tension in a romance. So I definitely brought that to the table. I didn't think too much about tropes or traits, but I think you end up writing them because when you read a lot of romance, we're all just regurgitating things that we've read in one way or another. That's all it is, really. No one has any original ideas deep down, and that's okay. So although I wasn't specifically going into it, I think, yeah, having the beats of a romance, you know that you have to fulfill certain criteria to then get you to the happily ever after. I definitely sort of brought that into it. And then my aim throughout was just, how could this be cozier? So
I think the thing that makes any piece of art original is that you made it.
yeah,
Like
exactly.
it could be like the same trope and the same characters, but because you wrote it, that's what makes it original.
You brought all your personal experience to it that no one else can have the exact same experience. So yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great segue into my question about like writing cozy. Which is, like, I guess the opposite of writing spice. But actually, no, they're not. Like, that's a false binary. I think this book proves.
I feel like they thread each other very
Yes, they
nicely.
do.
Yeah.
So I've seen this referred to in many places as a perfect cozy fall read, and I agree, it absolutely is. And I'd love to know what you think. What are the ingredients to like a perfect cozy fall read beyond like seasonal descriptions, which your book does so well. Like it is so beautiful the way that you describe October. Like
Yeah.
it's so nice.
It's my favorite month. I much like Michael Bublé thawing in November. I start to thaw in like late August, and come into my full power. I think, I think actually a rural setting in some ways, like whether it's not necessarily the focus throughout the book, but having like a village, a small town setting, somewhere where you can easily slip into nature feels so crucial to cozy in some ways. It was actually oddly quite difficult to think about how you make London feel cozy. And so I think that's why you have like a cafe. I think food is just clearly integral, like, The Hobbits, Redwall. Like there are so many examples of like classic cozy-ish fiction where it's just friends or family sitting around a table eating. So I think that's definitely one of them. So obviously this being her being a kitchen witch, there's a huge focus on food in this book. And I think the sort of coziness is through it almost is domestic in nature. I think in some ways it's the magical house where you have your family and your friends living. It's, the sitting on the sofa at the end of the day with your pet curled up on your lap. It's the small domestic things that we, I think, yearn for, which I think are completely sort of unrelated to seasonal. I think cozy inherently suits colder months because we want to be wrapped up warm with a hot drink, which feels very quintessentially cozy tonally to me. But yeah, I think it's more about a sort of feeling of being like coddled in some way.
Yeah. That makes a ton of sense to me. Yeah, and as you were speaking, it did occur to me that just like baking is super cozy. Like that's what we all did during the pandemic, because it's just when you don't know what to do, it's like, oh, here are 8 to 10 things to do in order. Like
I'm gonna make some bread and have a sourdough starter for the everyone was doing.
I actually can't look at banana bread anymore because I made so many loaves, but now I just have like PTSD when I smell it. So
oh my gosh, that was my comfort bake in the pandemic.
That's
too.
So funny.
I ventured into strawberry bread too. I was like, let's switch this up. That was
You have to give me that recipe. That sounds good.
I will.
Yeah, that was the thing too. I noticed a lot when I was reading this book was like, oh my God, I would kill for a cinnamon roll. I would kill for one. She's like describing how they're making them at the beginning of the book. I was like, can I have one right now? Can I just have a plate magically have one appear? That's what I want.
We definitely did a lot of baking when we were making this book.
Nice.
Oh, let's see. The
house.
Oh yeah, we have to talk about the house. I am so in love with the house.
I love the house.
Like it's yeah, if you could talk about how you wrote the house, how you came up with the idea, because it is a manufacturer of coziness. Like the house aids and abets in creating a cozy atmosphere. Yeah.
Yeah, I really just wanted to write I really wish that basically the Dina's parents, and it's their house within the book, were able to live in a riad, but there was no way. A riad is a form of North African housing, where you have an inner courtyard, sometimes with a fountain, sometimes with a garden in the center of the house. And there is all this sort of writing about like the courtyard being the soul of the home in many ways. And I really wanted to, my family had a riad in Morocco when I was growing up, and I spent lots of wonderful summers there. And I thought, how do I bring this, but they're living in the UK? And I thought, sentient magical house, that is the way to do it. It's sort of like Hill House from the Shirley Jackson novel without being terrifying and spooky and murderous. It's a sort of loving, don't look too closely at what it is. It's not a form of her mother's magic in any way. It's existed before they were there. You don't really know what it is or how it is, but it's just happy to have them living in it. And it sort of tweaks itself to their whims. So you have Dina's father is Welsh, and so when you go and you have this really beautiful cozy parlor with a crackling fire and big old leather armchairs, and then as you walk through to the kitchen, the carpet sort of swaps out for colorful tile, and then you're in this riad, and you have open sky with stars and beautiful like sort of rhododendrons and trying to think of names of plants now, but native Moroccan plants growing, sort of twining their way up the courtyard. And so I think it was really just, it came down to that, but I also really wanted to have a ghost tortoise just sprinkled in there. And so I was like, well, I have to.
Character.
No,
it is actually based on a story from my childhood where I was convinced I saw a ghost tortoise in our family home. So I had to put that in there. So yeah, but I love a sentient house. I think having like a building as a character is one of my favorite tropes in all forms of fantasy and sort of science fiction writing. Every single time I get something sent that to me on submission, I immediately bump it up to the top of my list.
It is really great, and it's so well done here. Oh, do you have any more questions, Kaye?
No, I was just going to say, I feel like that happens. So we get a lot of advanced reader copies here, which means it's past you at that point because it's going to be published. But I feel like that happens to me a lot too. That happened with your book. Jen sent me the email and I was like, oh, there's By Witch in this? Top of the list. We're reading this next. And so like that just keeps happening to me. I'm like I asked you about tropes earlier. My favorite trope is fake dating. The second there's a fake dating in any book, I'm like, that's the next book I'm reading. I don't know what it is about it. I just keep doing that.
Dating. I'm with you there.
Yeah, it's fun because it's so dumb.
Like this is never a good
answer
problem.
Yeah. You two idiots love each other already. Just admit it. No, they have to fake date. I love it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been so delightful.
Yeah. Great way to start our day.
I know.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been, absolutely delightful chatting.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, listeners, it's now on you. You're going to check out Best Hex Ever. It's an absolute delight, and by the time that you hear this, it will be out in the world. So please head to your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go for those things. All right, that's it for now. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.